It looks like Gearbox's response to all the performance criticisms, which is definitely showing up in like the Steam reviews, as most of the negative reviews bringing it down to a mixed result seem to be criticizing the performance, is to post these absolutely insane, I guess they're calling them optimization guides. Seems kind of like the most crazy detailed PC system requirements list I've ever seen, where they went from having like the most bare bones system requirements list I've ever seen, where it's like, here's minimum, here's recommended. What does any of it mean? What frame rate will you get? I don't know. What resolution are you playing at? I don't know. At what graphic settings? I don't know. They've gone like way off the deep end now on here's like every GPU ever and exactly what frame rate you can get and what they are calling optimized settings. Now for the NVIDIA lists, which came out a bit earlier, they said that they were getting these from NVIDIA, or that they worked with NVIDIA on those. Now, for the AMD versions, I'm not seeing that they're specifically stating that they worked with AMD on these, so I'm not sure on that. But yeah, we now have this for, okay, 1080p. Here's like a million GPUs and what kind of performance and graphic settings they're claiming to use for AMD 1080p, NVIDIA 1440p, AMD 1440p, NVIDIA 4K, AMD 4K. This is pretty interesting. So I do want to take a look at this because my initial reaction is it kind of feels like they're essentially just saying, of course you can be over 60 FPS, guys, just turn on frame generation. So we need to be very clear that frame generation is good in many ways. I think a lot of people will prefer playing with frame gen on to frame gen off, but it's not the same thing as performance. It does not make the game more responsive, and the lower the base frame rate that you are at, the worse the image quality is because it's interpolating between two frames. So the more different those two frames are, the more space there is between them, what's happening in them, the harder it is to interpolate accurately. So, in other words, most people prefer to use frame generation from a higher base frame rate, like at least already at 50 to 60 FPS, if not a lot more. This is like a personal preference thing. A lot of people have different opinions on where it feels good from. But I don't think most people consider optimal settings to be getting over 60 FPS by using frame generation. In other words, relying on frame generation to get there. So just want to mention that. Anyway, so let's take a look. So I'm also noticing some kind of baffling stuff in all of this. Because at first it seems like, oh, wow, this must be amazing. But then you dig into it, and some of it seems a little bit nonsensical. Like, okay, let's take an RTX 2080 Ti. Now, I don't have one of these to test it in this particular game myself. But I can tell you that in the vast majority, I would actually say like every test I've ever seen, the 2080 Ti is faster than an RTX 3060 Ti. It also has more VRAM. And so it's odd to me that they're saying a 2080 Ti, which is generally a little faster than a 3070 and has more VRAM, on a 1080p display, only going to be good for 30 frames per second, which to me feels like an admission of guilt. That the game is unoptimized. So if they're trying to say that this is, no guys, you're just doing it wrong. If they're saying a 2080 Ti is only good for 1080p upscaled from 720p to hit 30 frames per second. By the way, some other parts of the chart say 30 plus, so they're essentially saying just 30 here. Anyway, at a mixture of low and medium settings, again, upscaled from 720p to hit the 1080p output, this seems kind of insane, especially when they're saying that the 3060 Ti, which again is generally slower than a 2080 Ti, also upscaling from 720p to hit 1080p, is good for, 60 frames per second. Anyway, it just seems really, really bizarre that they would consider that optimal for the 2080 Ti and a 60 FPS target optimal for the 3060 Ti. So yeah, I'll just say that some of this does seem very strange. Anyway, now you might look at this and think that, oh, so cards like the 4060 Ti actually are good for 60 plus FPS, but do note that they are saying that that's using frame generation to get there. Again, coming from upscaling below 1080p to hit the output, and then on cards like the 4060 Ti that are 8GB cards, notice how low they turn most of the graphics settings. Most stuff is on low, with a few medium and a few high. So seems like also admitting that 8GB cards here could be struggling, and you got to turn things down pretty far to hang in there, and to make some VRAM room to use frame generation, it looks like. Anyway, the good news is on an RTX 4090, you can stay 60 plus FPS, although they still recommend upscaling from 720p and using 2x frame gen. But you can at least have the rest of the graphic settings turned up. Anyway, so that's what their 1080p optimal settings guide looks like, at least a sampling of it. There's a lot here. I'll link the sources in the video description. We definitely don't have time to go through all of it. But what about the AMD optimal settings for 1080p? Again, pretty much everything it seems to be relying on frame gen here. So they're like, come on, you can play at 60 plus FPS even on an RX 6600 XT. Just make sure you're, again, upscaling from below 1080p. Now, honestly, on the DLSS chart, I'm like, okay, the newer DLSS models do still look pretty dang good using DLSS quality on a 1080p display. It's really not that terrible. Using FSR, older versions of FSR, like would be supported on a 6600 XT, on a 1080p display certainly looks a lot less nice. And then they're saying still turn everything down to low and use frame generation. And now you're over 60 FPS, guys. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. That's what we're seeing here. They're saying, let's see, so like a 6800 XT, again, they're still wanting you to have frame generation on, but at least you can have most of the graphic settings turned up now, but they're still recommending that you upscale from below 1080p on that card, which is, honestly not too far behind in performance from cards like 4070s and 5070s. Just throwing that out there. Anyway, what about, but guys, you just have old cards. That's your problem. So how about get something brand new, like a, 9060 XT, 9070, 9070 XT. They're still recommending upscaling from below 1080p and, cards like the 9060 XT using frame gen and mostly medium settings to get that 60 plus FPS. So, anyway. So what if we were looking at 1440p recommendations? So 1440p recommendations, well, if you have a 5090, you can at least get by using DLSS quality and 4x frame gen to stay over 60 FPS. But you can max out most of the other settings, so everything's fine. Let's see. How do they see the 5060s doing? Now, the 5060, note that they're just saying 60 FPS here, not 60 plus. And they are including 4x frame gen. So that's a little concerning. Again, I haven't benchmarked it in this game, but this is what they're saying. Basically, they're saying just turn everything to low and kick on 4x frame gen and use balanced level upscaling to hit your 1440p output. And you should be around 60 frames per second. Again, I'm really hoping that that's actually in the 100 plus if you're using 4x frame gen. But like I said, I haven't actually tested the 5060 in this game. So that's kind of what we're looking at for 1440p. They're saying cards like a 3070 Ti, it's optimal to run them at a little over 30 FPS, but not quite be good for 60, using balanced level upscaling and a lot of stuff set to low. Anyway, but guys, it's your fault. You have a 3070 Ti. It's too old and too weak. That it's clearly not an optimization issue. Anyway, the AMD 1440p results, I'll admit, this is actually my first time really looking at them in any sort of detail. Let's see where we're at. So again, it's kind of a shame on the 6000 series and 7000 series AMD cards that they are recommending balanced level upscaling because they are stuck to the older versions of FSR, which don't look amazing. Although with this game's art style, might not be the absolute end of the world. But again, if you upscale from the balanced mode and kick on frame gen and on a lot of these turn down the graphics settings, you can probably stay over 60 plus FPS. So that's good. Let's see, what did they say about the 9070 XT? So they're saying 9070 XT, a balanced level upscaling on the 1440p output. At least now we have FSR4, so it should look pretty good. And at, mostly high, very high with some medium settings, and frame gen should be over 60 FPS most of the time. Now, I did actually test out the 9070 XT myself. So if we look at its 1440p performance, 1440p high settings with DLSS balanced, we could take a look at that. I was getting a little over, high at 1440p high settings native, I was barely over 60 FPS in what was probably not one of the most demanding areas of the game. And kicking on balance level upscaling did get me to triple digits, but again, was not in the most demanding area of the game. I wasn't using frame gen, so honestly, this optimal settings chart is really just making me scared. Did I need to get a lot further in the game to figure out, like that where I was testing was actually like where it performs well, at least relatively? Because, anyway, I don't know. Let's take a look at 4K real quick. So what are they thinking you need to play this game on 4K? The first thing I'm noticing is the weakest card they list is a 4070 Ti Super. So you definitely need quite a bit, it looks like, to have any shot at what they would consider an optimal 4K experience. A 3090 Ti, which is still actually fairly new, that came out way later into the generation, like only a few months, like less than a full year before we got the 40 series, and was like a $2,000 card. Just saying. They're saying that if you're mostly at low and medium settings and use performance mode upscaling, you're probably around 60 FPS, notice not 60 plus. And on the 4070 Ti Super, you just need performance mode upscaling with 2x frame generation and a mixture of low, medium, and a few high settings to be around 60 frames per second. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, so anyway, that's their optimal settings at 4K, and the AMD version looks like not a lot of cards are saying should be good for 4K here, but what do we got? 9070 XT, as long as you're in performance mode upscaling with frame gen on, you can have most stuff kicked up to stay over 60 FPS. Now, it does look like, I think frame gen here is putting in some work, because when I tested out the 9070 XT, again, in what is probably not necessarily the most demanding area of the game, wait, here's my 9070 XT testing. I did see that if you have most of the settings turned up, but are using performance mode upscaling, I was below 60 frames per second. So I don't think they're kidding about needing frame generation to stay over 60 on the 4K with performance mode upscaling if you have most of the settings turned up. So there's that. Anyway, yeah, it is what it is. Again, they're relying a lot on like performance mode upscaling with frame generation, and on a card like a 6950 XT, you better turn everything down to low as well. A few mediums in there, a couple of highs, I guess. All right. Anyway, I just thought this was really interesting because I can't remember ever seeing a game developer, publisher, whoever was responsible for putting this out there, putting out this kind of just incredibly detailed chart for essentially PC system requirements, like trying to say like what sort of performance to expect at what sort of settings on different cards. So in one sense, it's like kind of amazing, like wow that they put this out here. But from another way of looking at it, like I said, some of the suggestions, especially like I said, like that 2080 Ti for 30 FPS at 1080p upscaled, seem to be either not making sense, or if they do make sense, an admission that things aren't super optimized here. And they're basically seem to be relying on frame generation heavily to claim the over 60 FPS number in these results, which, yeah, is what it is. Anyway, if you're interested in performance testing in this game, I have tested out a max 5090, 9800X 3D based system, and did conclude that you have to turn the settings down a lot more than you might be used to on a $4,000 PC. I also have tested out the minimum and recommended PCs on their original system requirements charts. Anyway, you could take a look at that. I also do have the 5070 Ti directly head-to-head against the 9070 XT at a variety of settings at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K with upscaling on and off. Anyway, if you're interested in more information on this game, more testing, etc., you could let me know. I don't want to just put out content that you're not interested in. So if you're bored of the Borderlands 4 content, fine. But, a lot of people, despite all of this, the game is getting some pretty high concurrent player counts. Hit almost 300K concurrent today. It's in the top 3, it looks like, on Steam. And it's hard for anything to beat Counter-Strike 2 and Dota 2 for concurrent players. So pretty high up there. Guys, it's even beating Banana. So definitely tons of people still buying it, despite the mixed reviews. Seems to be mostly due to the performance numbers and stuff. So, and a lot of people's pretty happy with the game overall, it seems like, from a content perspective, although obviously there's always going to be a mixture of opinions on that too. But anyway, I'll link these giant settings lists in the description if you're interested, and hope all of you have an excellent day.